Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving deep today into some sources that talk about emerging virus threats and how it all connects to, well, politics.
It is fascinating how these sources kind of weave a narrative, almost like pre-planned pandemics,
Yeah.
and attempts to use these to undermine certain political figures.
Okay.
We're going to have to really carefully look at the evidence and all the different perspectives to understand what might be actually happening.
All right, let's jump into it.
Okay.
So one source claims that Dr. Fauci actually predicted a surprise outbreak during the Trump administration, and it was just days before the inauguration.
It almost feels like he knew it was coming.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting.
So this prediction, it came from a speech that Dr. Fauci gave in January 2017.
Okay.
He stated very clearly, there will be a surprise outbreak. And this was during the Trump administration, just days before Trump took office.
Wow.
And some people see this as way more than just a general observation about infectious diseases.
Yeah.
It's almost too specific.
It's a little eerie, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Then some of these sources even go so far as to connect Dr. Fauci to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
They claim he may have funded the very research that led to the creation of the virus.
And that's where things get, more complex.
Okay.
The COVID Select Committee report, they actually concluded that the virus most likely originated in a lab in Wuhan, China.
Right.
And these sources point to these claims that Fauci was funding gain-of-function research, and it was at that same lab.
Okay, so just to clarify, gain-of-function research is where scientists are manipulating viruses to study them to see, how dangerous they could be.
Exactly.
Right, and I know that research is really controversial because there's always that risk of accidentally releasing a pathogen.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
You can create something really dangerous.
Yeah.
And so these sources, they're really exploring this idea that Fauci's funding might have inadvertently contributed to creating the virus.
I see.
But we also have to remember that there are other scientists who say, no, the virus most likely came about naturally.
Okay, so we've got these two sides.
Yeah, two different perspectives on that.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
So we've got this prediction from Fauci, followed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, suspicious in itself. But to add another layer to this, we have Peter Hotez, a vaccine researcher who's also making these pronouncements about possible virus outbreaks.
Yeah, so Hotez he's voiced these concerns about multiple potential outbreaks, especially if, Trump were to return to office.
Okay.
He mentions threats like the H5N1 bird flu.
Right.
There's also, he says, there's a new coronavirus that's emerging in Asia.
Oh, wow.
And then a possible rise in mosquito-borne illnesses like dengue and Zika.
That's a lot.
Yeah, so, it's are these legitimate warnings or is this something else entirely?
Right, yeah.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Because, some sources see this as a continuation of, this alleged plan to use viruses for political gain, which is something that we've seen kind of emerge as a theme from these sources.
Yeah, so they're connecting Fauci's prediction to Hotez's statements.
Right. It's all kind of,
And they're seeing a pattern.
Yeah, a pattern there.
And it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and it's unsettling.
It is.
To think about these possibilities.
Speaking of unsettling, these sources also talk about claims about Bill Gates and the work that his foundation is doing in India.
Yeah, so Bill Gates, he's openly said that India basically serves as a major testing ground for new vaccines.
Right. Yeah.
That his foundation supports. And, he actually used the word laboratory during a podcast interview.
Yeah.
And he was describing, how they do their pilot rollouts and trials in India.
Using that word laboratory to describe that, that's a little...
It's a loaded term.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and these sources, they point out that this statement raises a lot of questions like, are people actually consenting to this? Yeah. Are there vulnerable populations being exploited?
That's right, yeah.
Are there conflicts of interest?
So how does Gates respond to this?
Well, he says that, the Gates Foundation, their office in India, is actually their largest one outside of the U.S.
Okay.
So it makes it, just more convenient and efficient to test these new interventions.
Right.
But critics argue that this doesn't really address the issue of power imbalance.
Right.
And how certain groups within India may be more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And how that could be taken advantage of.
It kind of makes you think back to past unethical medical experiments that have happened.
Exactly. And these sources draw parallels to things like the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Right, where they were denying treatment to people even though there was a cure available.
Exactly. And it makes you think about the ethics of all this, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations.
Especially when it comes to vulnerable populations, yeah.
Are they truly understanding what they're getting into?
Right,
That's a
yeah.
big concern.
So we've covered Dr. Fauci's predictions, the questions surrounding COVID-19's origins, Hotez's pronouncements,
Right.
and now these concerns about what Bill Gates is doing in India.
It's like we're uncovering this complex web of interconnected events.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And a little bit scary.
And it gets even more complex, right, when you consider how these sources connect all these events to paint this picture of intentionally releasing viruses
Yes.
for political purposes.
For political game, yeah.
Wait, are you saying these sources are suggesting that COVID-19 was intentionally released?
They are. And they're claiming that it was done specifically to sabotage Trump's chances of re-election back in 2020.
Okay, wow.
They argue that, he had a strong economy, he was pretty popular.
Right.
So that posed a threat to his political opponents.
Guys. So they're saying that they used this virus as a way to undermine his presidency.
Exactly, to create chaos, to sow distrust.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is.
What kind of evidence do they present to support this?
Well, they really build on a lot of what we've already talked about.
Okay.
So Fauci's prediction of this surprise outbreak,
Right.
the whole lab leak theory,
Uh-huh.
and then Hotez's pronouncements.
Right.
And they also highlight, Fauci's role in funding gain-of-function research, which they argue, that could have led to the creation of the virus.
So they're saying this was a coordinated attack.
Yeah, a deliberate and malicious act.
That's really unsettling to think about.
It is.
So what would be the motive? Why would someone do something like this?
Well, these sources, they offer a couple different possibilities.
Okay.
Like political sabotage,
Right.
right? Creating chaos.
Yeah.
Some even suggest, surveillance.
Wow.
And then some even get into more sinister motives like population reduction.
Yeah.
It gets pretty dark.
It is pretty dark.
Yeah. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot to process.
And it's important to remember that these sources, they're presenting a certain viewpoint
right.
that tends to be very distrustful of institutions
Okay.
and founders of authority.
Yeah. So what should we make of all of this?
What's really important is to think critically about all of this.
Yep.
Do your own research.
Right.
Consider all the different perspectives and really weigh the evidence carefully.
Right.
Are these genuine warnings about these potential health threats? Or is there something more sinister going on?
Right.
It's a question you have to answer for yourself.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
It is.
And here's another thought. If these powerful entities really can weaponize viruses, what does that mean for global health?
Yeah.
And security? That's a chilling question to leave you with.
It is chilling, and it highlights the need for awareness,
Yeah.
and critical thinking,
Yeah.
and maybe even a little bit of skepticism
Right.
as we navigate this world.
Absolutely.
It really is a chilling thought.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right.
Like some sci-fi thriller, but...
It's scary how it's like becoming more and more plausible.
Yeah, exactly. These sources suggest it might not be so far-fetched, and they even point to gain-of-function research as, like, proof that we already have the capability to manipulate these viruses.
Right. And with gain-of-function research, they are actually manipulating viruses
Right.
to make them, more transmissible, more deadly.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
Like, why would anyone even want to do that? I mean, what would be the motivation behind weaponizing a virus?
Well, these sources suggest a few different motives.
Yeah.
One that we already talked about is political power, right? And
Right.
a manufactured pandemic. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
You could create chaos. You could really sow distrust in the government,
Yeah.
and that could ultimately lead to some kind of power grab.
So they're using fear and instability to seize control.
Exactly. They're playing on people's fears.
Wow.
These sources also suggest the possibility of economic gain. Pharmaceutical companies, think about it. They could profit from a widespread health crisis.
It's cynical, but I guess it's possible.
Right. To exploit a pandemic for profit.
Yeah.
It's a scary thought. And these sources don't rule that possibility out.
Wow.
And they even suggest like some really disturbing motives, things like population control, even ethnic cleansing.
Are those motives even realistic?
It's important to remember that these sources, they do rely on a lot of speculation.
Okay.
And they connect dots that might not be fully supported by evidence,
Right.
But even if those extreme motives aren't likely, the fact is, the potential is there.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that viruses can be used as weapons, that's a real danger.
That's scary.
It is.
So What can we do about it? I mean, how do we protect ourselves from this kind of threat?
The first step is awareness. We
Mm,
need to understand how this could happen
right.
and why someone would want to do it.
Yeah.
We also need to demand transparency from our governments and from these research institutions, especially when it comes to gain-of-function research.
Well, I mean, that's where it all starts, right?
Yeah, it needs careful scrutiny and regulation.
It makes sense, but we also need to be prepared to respond if something does happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We need to invest in really strong public health systems,
Okay.
ones that can respond quickly and effectively, whether the outbreak is, natural or manufactured.
It feels so overwhelming, though.
Yeah.
It's like we're facing this invisible enemy that could just strike at any time.
It is a challenging reality, but knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we know about it, the better we'll be able to advocate for change
Okay.
and demand accountability from the people in power.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
So staying informed, staying vigilant, and demanding transparency, those are kind of the key things here.
exactly. And we have a voice. We need to use it
Right.
to hold people accountable
Yeah,
and advocate for policies that really put public health and safety first,
absolutely.
above all else.
Now, these sources also talk about the media
Yes.
and how they shape public perception.
The media's role is really crucial right now.
Right.
They inform the public about these threats, but these sources, they express concern about media bias
Oh,
and manipulation.
interesting.
They accuse these mainstream outlets of downplaying or even suppressing information that challenges the official narrative.
So they're saying we can't trust the media?
Not necessarily. I think what they're suggesting is we need to be critical
Okay.
of what we read and what we hear.
So we need to be our own fact checkers.
In a way, yeah.
Wow.
We're bombarded with information all the time, and it's really easy to just kind of get swept up in these narratives that may
Right.
not be entirely accurate.
Right. And these sources also highlight, the increasing polarization in society and how we're losing trust in institutions.
Yeah,
And it seems like that would just make it harder to talk about these complex issues.
it does. It makes it much more difficult. Because people are so quick to dismiss any viewpoint that's different from their own.
Yeah, exactly.
Or label anyone who questions things as a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, it's like we've lost the ability to even have a civil conversation.
Right, to debate things constructively.
Yeah, exactly.
And so these sources really emphasize that we need to be more open-minded,
Okay.
to have respectful dialogue,
Right.
and to be willing to listen to different viewpoints,
Yeah.
even if they're unconventional.
So they're calling for a more nuanced approach.
Exactly, less tribalistic.
It's a tall order, I think, given, how things are right now.
It is.
But it's definitely a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely. We need to be able to talk about these things.
Yeah.
Even when they're controversial or emotionally charged.
It is easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
But if we want to find common ground, we have to be able to have these respectful dialogues.
Exactly. That's the only way we're going to move forward.
So what are some steps we can take to address this threat of biowarfare and the concerns these sources bring up?
There are things we can do individually and as a society.
Okay.
We can support organizations that are working to raise awareness about this
Yeah.
and advocate for stronger regulations.
So finding groups that really align with our values.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we can contact our elected officials
Right.
and urge them to take biosecurity measures seriously.
Making our voices heard.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And of course, we need to continue to educate ourselves
Right.
and others about this
Right.
and engage in these open and respectful discussions.
Yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed
Right.
when we talk about biowarfare.
Yeah.
But we're not powerless.
No, we're not.
We can all play a role
Absolutely.
in making things safer.
It takes a collective effort, a willingness to engage in these difficult conversations, and a commitment to holding people accountable.
Absolutely.
But it's a fight worth having.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci's predictions, the origins of COVID, the possible motives for weaponizing viruses, the role of the media,
Yeah.
and the importance of critical thinking.
They've gone deep.
What other takeaways would you say are important for our listeners?
I think one really crucial point is questioning authority.
Okay.
Don't just blindly accept what you're told,
Right.
whether it's by experts or government officials. Critically evaluate that information.
Trust, but verify.
Exactly. We have to be discerning,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to these complex issues.
Absolutely. So critical thinking, healthy skepticism,
Yeah,
willingness to question the status quo.
it's so important.
Yeah, those are essential tools here.
These sources encourage us to be active participants in all of this,
Okay.
not just passive recipients of information.
Right.
Do your research, Ask questions, challenge assumptions.
It's a call to action
It is.
to be informed and to advocate for a safer world.
Exactly. A more transparent world.
And these sources, they're definitely controversial, but they're a wake-up call.
Yeah, they are.
To be vigilant, demand accountability, take an active role.
We can shape our future.
Now, this brings us to a question I've been thinking about this whole time.
Okay.
If these sources are right, and these powerful entities can weaponize viruses, what happens to trust?
It's a really profound question. If we can't trust the institutions that are supposed to be protecting us,
Right.
if we can't even be sure that the information we're getting is accurate, then what?
Yeah, where do we turn?
Right. It's like truth itself becomes a casualty.
Yeah, it really does feel that way.
And that's why it's so important to be critical thinkers,
Right.
to have discernment and, a healthy amount of skepticism.
Right.
We can't just blindly trust any single source.
So we have to develop our own sense of what's right, like our own internal compass
Exactly.
to navigate this crazy
It's a
world.
complex and deceptive world, yeah.
Right.
But we're not alone.
Okay.
There are others out there who share these concerns, who want to find the truth and hold people in power accountable. We just have to find each other and work together
I like that, yeah.
to create a safer, more transparent world.
It's easy to get overwhelmed with all this, the potential for harm and manipulation, but there's also hope. Like, we can make a difference.
I agree. It's challenging but necessary, and it starts with each of us,
Yeah.
by being committed to the truth, demanding accountability, and working together.
That's a good point to end on.
Yeah.
It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah,
We can create a better future.
we can.
It's interesting you mentioned trust because, these sources spend a lot of time looking at the actions and motivations of certain people like Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates.
Yeah, you're right. They kind of focus on them a lot.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they see Fauci and Gates as these really influential figures in public health.
Okay.
And, that impacts global affairs.
Right.
And when you have that level of influence,
Yeah.
you're going to be scrutinized.
Right. Especially with all this stuff going on.
Yeah. Especially with these sensitive topics like, viruses and vaccines.
Yeah, for sure.
People are going to have questions.
So let's start with Fauci. These sources seem really concerned about his role in funding gain-of-function research. Could you kind of break that down for our listeners?
Sure. So gain-of-function research involves manipulating viruses.
Right.
They're making them more transmissible
Okay.
or deadly. The point is to study them,
Yeah.
to understand how they evolve, how to counter them.
Right.
But it's very controversial because of the risk.
Right.
I mean, what if you accidentally release this modified pathogen?
Yeah, that's scary.
It's a big concern.
So these sources are basically saying that they're worried that Fauci's support of this research might have led to, accidentally creating COVID.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the concerns that they bring up.
Okay.
They talk a lot about his funding of coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology,
Right.
which is, where some people believe the whole pandemic started.
Right.
And they're wondering, were the risks really thought through
Yeah.
when they made those funding decisions?
And what about Bill Gates?
Yeah.
His work in India seems to be another big focus.
Yeah, Gates has openly said that India is like a testing ground for the vaccines that this foundation supports.
Right.
He even called it a laboratory,
I remember that.
which, understandably raised some eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a pretty loaded word.
yeah.
And these sources are not happy about it.
Right.
They're questioning, is it ethical
Yeah.
to use a country like India, which has a lot of vulnerable people,
Yeah.
as this testing ground?
Right.
They're worried about informed consent,
Right.
exploitation,
Yeah. Are the risks really worth the potential benefits?
Exactly. That's the big question.
So it seems like they're tying all of this together. Fauci, his funding decisions, Gates, and his work in India. They're saying these powerful people are kind of overstepping these boundaries.
Yeah. And, they're saying they're doing this in the pursuit of scientific progress,
Right.
but at what cost?
Exactly.
Are they really thinking about the ethical implications?
So they're saying don't just blindly trust these figures of authority.
Even if they say they're doing it for the greater good.
So what should our listeners take away from all of this? What are they supposed to do with this information?
Well, these sources are calling for action.
Uh-huh.
They want us to be informed,
Yeah.
to really engage in these open and honest discussions about these complex issues
Okay.
and demand transparency from our leaders,
Yeah.
from our institutions.
So we all have a responsibility.
Yes, we have a shared responsibility to make sure that science is used ethically
Okay.
for the benefit of everyone.
I mean, it's a challenging task, right?
It is, but it's so important.
Yeah.
These sources are saying we have the power to change things,
Yeah.
but it requires our active engagement.
So it's a call to action,
It is.
to informed and to advocate.
Absolutely.
Well, this has definitely been a lot to think about.
It has.
It's been a journey exploring viruses, scientific advancement, political power.
And all the ethical questions that come with it.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
not easy stuff.
And these sources might be controversial, but they remind us that these issues aren't just hypothetical.
Right.
They have real-world consequences.
Absolutely, and they're affecting people all over the world.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. It's been so helpful in navigating this.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And the most important thing is that we all continue to explore these issues.
Yes.
Ask questions and form our own informed opinions.
That's how we made progress.
Absolutely. So on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And keep researching, keep thinking critically, and keep engaging in respectful dialogue.
Absolutely. It's so important.
And remember, the future isn't set in stone. We have the power to change things, to create a world where science is used ethically and responsibly, and everyone deserves a chance to live a healthy and fulfilling life.
I agree. That's what we should all be striving for.
Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.